Hi, this is Jamie Rogers from NASCA headquarters. Welcome everyone to our NASCA webinar. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We are headquartered here in Lexington, Kentucky, and it's a nice gray, cold day, but we are excited to be hosting this webinar with some thought leaders and state leaders. Today we're hosting a webinar on building a risk management approach for state government. And so NASCA, for those who may, I think most of you are with NASCA and Departments of Administration, but for those who aren't, I want to tell a little bit about NASCA. NASCA is the member organization that represents state chief administrators. We represent state chief administrators around the country, and for the most part, this is a secretary or cabinet level official that oversees operations. The chief administrators across the country have a large purview that includes procurement, fleet, facilities, and in many states, IT, HR, and also risk management. And so knowing that the state chief administrator oversees a big purview, we try to do a couple things here at NASCA. One thing we think we do really well is convene people to share thought leadership and best practices. And as part of that, over a year ago, our board wanted to take a more robust model of combining best practices and coming up with research that was done at NASCA. And so that's what led to our research partnership with McKinsey & Company. Now for the second year, we have done a survey of our members highlighting what are some best practices and what are some case studies around a couple topics. Earlier this year at our institute, which is our annual meeting, we launched 3 different reports, one on facilities, one on implementing digital government, and the last one on risk management, which we're going to talk about today. So before I hand it to our speakers, I'm just going to go over a little bit of housekeeping. If you're not already on mute, it usually works well to mute yourself while the speakers are talking. We do at NASCA really like sharing best practices, so there will be a time at the end for conversation and talking and asking questions of our panelists. So if you'll mute yourself until then, it'll be helpful so we don't get any reverb. And also, if you are at a desk working and you don't want to talk but have a question, there's actually a chat box feature. So you can write questions in the chat box, and either myself or Jay, who's going to help moderate this conversation, could read those chat boxes. So that's a little bit about NASCA, who NASCA represents. Our mission is to drive operational excellence and work with states, and then why we've been doing more of these reports, and we're really excited today to share this webinar. So I'm going to go over here and tell you a little bit more about our speakers today. First, I'm really excited to have one of our state members, our state chief administrator, the Secretary of Administration, Alan McVeigh from the state of West Virginia. He was very helpful in coming out with the reports, looking at the reports, and then also sharing best practices in person with other chief administrators. And second, we have Dan Williams, who is a thought leader at McKinsey & Company, who's been extremely helpful in writing the risk management report. And I'm really excited, based on his previous experience working with the public sector, to hear more about him today. And then lastly, I want to introduce Jay Truesdale, who's going to serve as our facilitator for this conversation, who really we work side by side writing these risk management papers, writing reports. And so the reports that were some of the data we're going to talk about was really driven by our state members and the state chief administrators, and it has been an excellent opportunity for us to hear from states as well as thought leaders. So with that, Jay, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and good morning to those on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast. I'm delighted to be a part of this webinar and to speak about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Just a bit more about me. I've been at McKinsey for about 2.5 years and spend most of my time working with public sector institutions and also working on risk-related topics, ranging from what we're going to talk about today, enterprise risk, to actually what happens when things go wrong and a crisis emerges. and do a lot of work with organizations that are in crisis management mode. Before joining McKinsey, I was in the public sector myself, and had a risk management and oversight role at several different positions. So I definitely feel like I understand where many of you are coming from. And as I looked at the participants, I saw that there were several chief administrative officers who are joining us, and very warm welcome to all of you. And there are also many folks who have different roles related to risk in organizations around the country, including many chief risk officers. So great to be speaking with you as well. And I hope towards the end of the discussion, when there's opportunity for Q&A, that you'll definitely ask questions and share your insights. If you go to the next slide, please, the one after that. We're going to spend just a couple minutes talking about the survey that we conducted together between McKinsey and NASCA. A survey was conducted as a part of the broader thought partnership, which Amy mentioned. And we did this first last year and again this year, with the idea really of responding to the most important topics that you yourselves, members of this community, raised and felt were the critical topics that needed to be addressed in a deeper way, and with kind of data and with analysis that supported that data. And as Jamie mentioned, we've been doing this for a couple years. And the goal is really to hear your voice and to get your input. And really what we do is create a survey so that your input is not only solicited, but that we can kind of manage it and analyze it and have it make sense, and then play it back to you based on what we've heard from you. So if you please go to the next page, Jamie. This year we had 33 states participate from all over the country. And as you see on the left, there were 3 primary topics. These were the topics that the chief administrative officers themselves had suggested were very important. And not only did these topics get suggested by you yourselves, but we worked hand in hand with you to refine the actual survey and to make sure the questions we asked were actually the questions you wanted answered. And then once we got the data, then we worked with you to make sure we understood the data correctly and that we were synthesizing in a way that would be helpful. Next slide, please, Jamie. So among the set of questions related to risk, there were several that we asked about how risk management was done at the state level. And really, as you see on the right-hand side, there were 2 main types of questions. Who has overall authority and oversight within the state structure? And how is risk monitored and evaluated? And based on those 2 questions and the responses that we received from them, we recognize they're broadly speaking 4 categories of risk management and risk oversight throughout the country at the state level. As you see, upper right-hand corner, roughly half of the states that were surveyed fall under this category of risk owner. And what is a risk owner? Well, as you see on the left-hand side, it's an organization that has designated someone to, or some element of the state's structure to have overall management, and where there is some system of regular evaluation and some degree of regular management, and typically where there's a strategy involved in doing so. On the bottom left corner, you see a category that we somewhat cheekily called risk prone, which is roughly 15% of states in the country. And as you can see, there in those states, there's no centralized risk management authority, nor is there a strategy around risk or even a strategy foreseen. And then risk collaborator and risk responder kind of fall within between those 2 extremes. And that encompasses roughly 1/3 of the state's total. So again, from the survey results, we saw a broad range of approaches we saw by and large states moving up and to the right, but we recognize that there's a wide range of ways in which the topic of risk is understood and addressed. And next slide, please. We asked several questions in our survey about what were the most important topics that chief administrative officers were concerned about. And we had several to choose among, and there were also, there was another category where folks could write in. And as you can see, over 50% of those CAOs that have risk management responsibility had responsibility in the areas that we've put in dark blue: cybersecurity, facility security, employee safety, financial security, and that can mean a broad range of things, from sort of budget, ensuring that budget cycles are being addressed, that some states have constitutional balanced budget amendments. Some states have considerable concern around debt, so that was a major issue. And also 50% of CAOs said crisis response, disaster response, and continuity of operations were topics within their purview. And then communication and supply chain risk were also topics that came up. As you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, some conclusions that we were able to bring back to you all were were threefold. The major observations we got from this data was that most states, not all, but most states have not established what we call a taxonomy of risk. They have not identified the full range of potential risks that state may be facing, nor have they sought to prioritize those risks and then build a kind of consistent program around how to address them. And we'll talk more about that later when both Alan and Dan speak. Second major observation is that many states have not designated anyone to have the role of being responsible for risk. As you can see, roughly 50% of the states did do that, but roughly 50% haven't done that, and that's a major finding for us and for everyone in this community, in the sense that we believe that there is a real opportunity to broaden. If there is someone designated, it's for a kind of a narrow area, and if someone yet hasn't been designated to do this, there's an opportunity to really establish a risk management function that has broad oversight. And then the third major observation we came to as a result of this survey was where CAOs are not responsible for risk. And there are many states where CAOs themselves aren't responsible, but where someone else within the state organization has risk management authority. We believe that based on your feedback, there is much more opportunity for collaboration across agencies, either through kind of a centralized board led by someone in the governor's office, or by an agency, whichever agency within the government is responsible for risk management, to ensure that the agencies themselves are communicating and coordinating amongst each other. Next page, please. So our core takeaways from this survey, and which we'll talk more about in detail, is that there is ample opportunity for a strengthened enterprise risk management function. So risk management being done across the entire government. A lot of the risk work at the state level is done simply to manage compliance, which is an important function, but it also isn't addressing all the potential areas of concern that might arise given certain scenarios. Another major takeaway is that there are lots of ways to use analytics and data to detect where there are blind spots and also how those might be addressed. A third major takeaway is that many states actually don't even think about risk as being something that is part of the day-to-day work of government. And even those that do have the risk function kind of sideline it because it doesn't bubble up to a matter of importance until it's almost too late. And so a lot of what we heard from you is that there needs to be a change in kind of mindset and a change in culture in organizations to really address risk head on and to be prepared for worst case scenarios. And then states, once they develop that ability, they need to test it, they need to practice it, practice their emergency response, practice their responses to various types of situations, either through tabletop exercises or training programs. And the core takeaway we heard from you is that much more muscle memory needs to be built around how to address risk. And then the final takeaway is that from all of you, we heard that really no one feels like they're addressing risk topics in a uniformly well-managed way. Of course, there are several states that do this well, and we'll hear from one of them shortly. But by and large, there is no one model out there to which everyone can aspire to and begin to change their approach around. There are lots of various models. There are lots of various ways of doing it, and obviously it's going to be dependent on how each state's government is structured, the amount of money that's available for individual states, the type of issues that states face, what they're prone to, and how they prioritize risks. But we do believe that there are several approaches that states can take that are uniformly the right approaches, and which can help states regardless of their place on that matrix that I pointed out before. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Alan, who not only is an expert in this topic, having been in the insurance business for most of his career and having been the insurance commissioner in West Virginia prior to being the secretary. Alan has built an approach that we think is quite remarkable in the sense that it's highly collaborative. It is bringing on agencies from across the government to think about risk and to manage it in an active way. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alan and look forward to hearing your presentation, Alan.
Thank you, Jay. Excellent. Jamie, you can go to the next slide. Just to let you know, I did not put this program together, and one of my slides will tell you that this program started about 60 years ago here in West Virginia, and actually my deputy secretary, who's also the executive director of the Board of Risk and Insurance Management, Mary Jane Pickens, who's on this webinar today, has taken it to, I think, the next level. But our West Virginia code points out that we will have a supervised insurance program, which actually will, as I go through these slides, will let you know that we include a lot of risk management because insurance is only one way of handling risk. There are a number of other ways. One of them is to transfer it to an insurance company. Go ahead, Jamie. We do provide centralized services. We are definitely a risk owner with a lot of collaboration. And as I mentioned, this program actually started about 60 years ago. We wanted it to be something that would take away the costly and inefficient way that we handled risk prior to that. And one way was to centralize it into one organization. And as you can see, the focus of our staff is to understand not only insurance markets and insurance products and services, but the most effective way to either minimize or transfer risk. Next. In the absence of a centralized service, you unfortunately get things like redundancy and efficiency, a much higher cost. The big thing that we've addressed is the one here, lack of predictability and budget stability, which is a big thing that I think we've taken care of. but inability to effectively coordinate risk management best practices, which our BRIM staff does quite well, and also legal uncertainty. Next. By the way, I'm going to take you through these pretty quickly. I have about 20 slides, and I'm told I have 10 minutes, so we'll do this quickly. We do have a board. It's comprised of 4 members appointed by the governor. You must be a West Virginia resident and have experience in law, accounting, business, insurance, or actuarial science. And we have an excellent board, and have had an excellent board for quite a long period of time. Our 5th member of that board is the Vice Chancellor of Health Sciences of the West Virginia Higher Education Policy Commission, and the Insurance Commissioner actually serves on the board ex officio. Next. We have 26 employees. We operate, in my opinion, just like an insurance carrier. Over half of BRIM staff have earned and maintained professional qualifications and appropriate certifications and licenses. I, for one, have 5 insurance designations, and I think there are a number of people at BRIM that have even more than that. We do also have a chief financial officer. That's also a very important part of what we do, is to maintain financial stability. Next. The actual insurance coverages that we maintain are pretty broad. The one thing about BRIM, a number of years ago, we were able to negotiate a manuscripted policy form where we include a lot of coverage that a regular insurance carrier out in the private market wouldn't necessarily want to provide or even be able to provide. But because of the type of risk that we have in state government, we felt having these coverages is very necessary. Go ahead. Again, I mentioned the manuscripted policies. We're also often able to secure multiple year pricing, which saves a lot of money in the long run. We control the costs in markets experiencing cyclical fluctuation. We also, even though we don't sit on a coastline, we do have storms here, and because we are a mountainous state, flooding is a huge issue here as well. So we do have periodically catastrophic weather events, just like a lot of you have across the country. Our annual premium to fund each of these policy years is determined by actuarial studies, and thank goodness we have no unfunded liability in the program. Next. As you can see, we insure over 160 state agencies, boards, and commissions. And we also, since the mid-1980s, by executive order, also provide insurance coverage for about 950 entities. And I'm going to take you to the next slide, which shows you what that is comprised of. Political subdivisions, charitable organizations, public service organizations, and emergency medical services agencies. And there's the entire list. But we provide that coverage because at one time, we'd actually had one of our liability crunches in the market back in the mid-80s, and there were a lot of these organizations that couldn't buy insurance for any price. Next. Our underwriting department does work closely with independent actuaries to develop our premiums, and those premiums are allocated among the various agencies with analysis of 5-year claims loss data for each of our insureds, and exposure information, which I will very quickly outline shortly, and a consideration of the administrative expenses which are needed to handle each of those agencies. Next. Annually, we go out to the various agencies and ask them for updated underwriting information, which gives us an idea of what risk we're dealing with. That information is listed, basically general information, the types and numbers of vehicles they have, who their agency personnel are, various liability exposures, particularly any changes that they've had, and also a good amount of information about the property that they own and lease, and also any medical services that are provided. Next. Here is where we get into true risk management. We do offer loss control consultation visits by our very professional staff. And just to give you an idea of how far we go with that, we also collaborate with the state agency workers' compensation carrier and program, which is housed in the insurance commissioner's office. So we also provide services for safety and loss control for employees as well. Also, property and casualty loss prevention inspections, boiler and machinery and air conditioning and inspection services. We also have a standards of participation program that you, if you meet certain standards of actually managing your risk by that agency, you can get discounts with your insurance premiums. We also provide quite a bit amount of loss control education and outreach services as well. Next. Here are their areas of expertise that we have: fleet management, employment practices. I'm going to take you down to cybersecurity. We had a cybersecurity incident with one of our county boards of education. They were held ransom, and through some collaboration with BRIM, our privacy officer, which is located now in BRIM, and also our Office of Technology, actually put a disaster team together, went on site to that county, and actually took care of that situation very well. And in collaboration with our insurance carrier and their personnel, hopefully they will be putting together a lot more security, which I hope will be a model for all of those types of organizations going forward. We do have a lot of outreach by our loss control specialists, and if these agencies will communicate with us, we end up having very positive business relationships because we reduce their risk and we reduce the cost for that. Next. Each year we partner with one of our insurance carriers to do safety, operation, and maintenance of boiler and air conditioning systems consultation. Again, we presented a lot of meetings. Our loss control specialists are certified OSHA general industry trainers, which help with that part of their risk. And our loss control department periodically sends notification of various topics out, and it's a way for us to be proactive with all of these people. And again, here in West Virginia, we happen to have, you know, severe weather periodically, and we like to think that our various organizations are trying to mitigate any potential problems as much as they can. Next. Again, I bring up the standards of participation program. It means that you're meeting certain minimum risk management requirements, which is intended to help you think about forming a more comprehensive approach to preventing any things that do happen. We also perform audits, 1,133 safety and loss control programs of our various agencies. Compliance, as I said, with all of this gets you a lower premium cost where we do provide credits. Unfortunately, some organizations don't follow those ideas, and unfortunately, we do have to place a surcharge on those premiums for those entities. Next. We employ 5 licensed insurance adjusters. As you can see, they have a total combined experience in the private sector of 60 years, total combined experience of claim staff in governmental programs, 52 years. Goes a long way in allowing them to assist our insureds when they do have problems. Next. What types of claims? They tend to go around the spectrum: civil rights claims, of course, law enforcement claims, medical malpractice, of course, motor vehicle claims, which tend to be the greatest number we have, premises liability, also sexual assault and abuse claims. So it's a wide variety of claims that government associations have. Next. Our financial plan, these are the 6 primary objectives. Again, we fully fund all liabilities for the programs. We ensure adequate working capital. We want to make sure that we have the funds there to take care of any claims that do occur. We maintain sufficient funds to fully support our operations and also maximize the overall return on investments, which have been good the past several years. We also maintain sufficient short-term liquidity to provide for unexpected things that do happen, and they do. And our program, we also try to follow the best practices of insurance carriers by meeting or exceeding those key financial ratios as well. Next. Effective 2005, we established an annual pre-funded trust program, and this is a little different. Mary Jane could probably explain this to you a lot better than I could, but it's a way for us to actually cover all of the liability claims that we have each policy year in accordance with our actuaries' models. We also have a comprehensive rating model to help to ensure recovery of program costs. And again, I come back to investment returns are anticipated to cover the cost of pre-funding those discounted liability claims within the trust. And that annual pre-funding of the trust works in terms of us being able to maintain a positive net position with each program, which is very important. Next. Net asset reserve policy. We all know that unexpected things will occur. We want to make sure we have an adequate level of net asset reserves to provide funds to offset operating deficits resulting from those unexpected events and economic uncertainties and lean funding periods. It's very critical to do that, and if you're able to successfully do that, and we have, it gives you budget predictability, not only for the program itself, but also for our agencies. Next. I believe that ends my part of the presentation, and I think I met the time frame. What do you think, Jay?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alan. That was great. I really appreciate it. And we'll come back to you when folks have questions at the end. But I think now we can turn to Dan to talk about some of the best practices that we've seen around the country, both in public and in the private sector.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Alan. And just to bring together the context of the next few pages, this is bringing really the leading practices that we see both in the private sector, as Jay had mentioned, particularly in financial services, which have been under the highest degree of scrutiny in this area of risk management, particularly since the financial crisis, as well as across the public sector, where we see a number of organizations, both at the state and at the federal level, who have really begun to think about how to build out their programs holistically, with the idea of how do I actually stand up a risk management oversight and management program that really delivers value for all stakeholders involved. And value is an important find because it's not always the same for each public sector actor. It's very much tied to the mission of each entity or agency. And it oftentimes is a critical component to have in focus when you think about making decisions and trade-offs, in particular setting the risk appetite. But where I wanted to start was on page 31, an example of taxonomy. I think it's important to reiterate what Jay said, that most states responded that they don't have a defined taxonomy. And that's a particular, not to say that this is the exact right taxonomy for everyone. In fact, every taxonomy, both across the private sector and public sector, there's a degree of variability in how each entity actually either names things or slots the more detailed risk types under each one, right? So for example, if I talk about cybersecurity here on page 31, that in this example can fit underneath number 2, an infrastructure and service delivery risk. When you think of an attack that may be a ransomware, as Alan mentioned, or a denial of service, that's one type of threat vector, and may be covered by a team thinking different than the team that's about information security with respect to not only are my databases secure, am I using the data appropriately, am I also thinking about the physical assets and the data that I have there and what the vulnerabilities are. So one of the reason why the taxonomy such as this is important is it helps if you take a head of a governor's view or head of an agency or a CEO level view to start answering 4 critical questions, which I think are essential to any effective risk management program, which is, number 1, what risks am I exposed to, right? Or are we exposed to? Number 2, how bad can they be? And as I think about how bad they can be, how do I compare that across different risk types, risk events? And how do I think about prioritizing my time or our time collectively such that we're focusing on the things that will have the most impact, again, to deliver more on the mission to ensure the greatest value to the public is ensured. And then 3, who's responsible for managing the risks, right? I mean, we talk about often that, I think back to what Jay had said, there's no designated authority or responsibility for risk. But if you take that from the way the private sector has now been thinking about it, a centralized risk function is an oversight function, right? It is responsible and mandated by the financial regulators to define the enterprise risk management framework, to ensure that the appropriate risk identification, measurement, monitoring, mitigation is occurring in the first line, which is, the business units, the functions. I think in the context of states, it would be the other agencies that are responsible for delivering on their missions around this taxonomy or wheel. So a centralized risk management function is one of its core responsibility is to set the playing field and ensure, again, the common language and understanding of what the expectations are. And then finally, what are we doing about the risks that we're exposed to? I think importantly, Alan mentioned that insurance is just one type of action in managing your risks, right? It's a risk transfer, but there are others where you can have risk mitigation, risk avoidance, further risk control, right? Where you decide to change pricing, change policy, add additional training. All of those things can be different types of risk mitigating actions, which is important because it is the optimal solution for delivering on any mission is going to oftentimes require the deployment of multiple risk mitigation strategies in order to get the best outcomes. So if I look again on page 31, I think this is an important first step for each risk management function that's being stood up or that is looking to mature to the next level, to succinctly articulate and create the common language or lexicon for risk for the agencies and entities that are within scope. If we move to the next page, thank you, Jamie. What we've done here is just laid out, we had 2 objectives. One is to make sure that we had the page with the most words out of any of the others in the presentation. So hopefully we won on that one. And the second is to just lay out some of the little bit more of the depth, right, behind this taxonomy and give some examples of what it means. And the point that I would want to make here again is that successful organizations, the ones that are really actually driving change into managing risk more effectively, are backing their taxonomy and how they manage their risks, right? So if they think about, a lot of times you can have a very theoretical exercise whether or not you should categorize your risk by the drivers, right? Is it climate change? Is it a terrorist threat? Or you could think about it as the impacts, right? Is it the fact that we can't fund the budget? Is it that we have a poor response to a natural disaster? But often what we've actually found is that aligning it to how you manage those risks on a day-to-day basis is the most effective way to do it. So if you think about, take health and safety, right? There's a very natural alignment to existing police departments, police agencies, fire agencies, health and human services departments, where a lot of these practices are actually in place. And it's a bit more about ensuring that you have a common view across all of your risk types versus saying, we're not doing anything to manage risks. In fact, I would argue that everyone is managing risk on a daily basis. Everyone has a responsibility for managing risk. The real challenge that risk management functions have in really leveraging and delivering value is being able to create that cross-cutting view across all the risk exposures and be able, again, to prioritize executive level attention and resources to addressing the biggest gaps as they exist. So this, again, is just an example of how to get down even further into the details. If we move to the next page, again, another one where we were trying to win with the density of words, but hopefully this will be helpful for folks just to think through, now that you've created the common language, and I would say after creating the common language, it's important to create the coverage map, right? So where across the different organizations within the state are you exposed to those different risk types? Then the question becomes, for each of those areas that are, or agencies or entities that are responsible for managing those risks on a day-to-day basis, what's the maturity of their risk management program, right? And if you think about it, oftentimes folks start with the strategy and framework, and they'll have that as, the enterprise risk management or the risk management division or the chief risk officer will have to set a policy, a framework, the vision and mission, and being a key point then leads into a risk appetite. They'll have to create a risk register. They'll have to create some sort of reporting mechanisms. All of that sort of sits at the top of, what's the overall risk strategy and framework. And it's important that, that's not just something that is too high level and theoretical, but it's actually driven down into the different entities that are managing it on a day-to-day basis. Then importantly, there's the processes, right? And I think this is important because there is a commonality here of, have you done your risk identification? Have you done your measurement and assessment? Have you done your monitoring and testing? I think the audit example that Alan laid out is a great example of going in and saying, okay, we believe that there's a lot of risk management practices being good practices in place, but let's go in and verify, because if it isn't being done, then they should be paying more. Or if it's being done very effectively, the risk exposure should be lower, and therefore it should be less costly in the risk transfer and insurance. And then importantly, it's the remediation and continuous improvement. We could also call this, oftentimes this is called control or mitigation, but it really is about essentially identifying gaps or opportunities to improve managing risk, right? Once you've identified, measured, and monitored it, it's about making changes and then feeding those changes back into how you operate. And it's very much about an operational mindset and how you actually deliver on the different activities across the different entities. The next piece, which is oftentimes another really sort of high-level focus, is the organization and governance, right? There's the oversight function. So where does that sit? How central is it? Is it external to other agencies, or is it internal to each agency? There's clarity of who is doing what. Again, I think importantly, in roles and responsibilities, it's the delineation between what is oversight and what is actually management. And then there's the committee structure, the reporting, the bringing, and all that. All those things, I think, are oftentimes they're done, but potentially they're done in a way that's a bit ivory tower, where they're designed from afar and they're not really reviewed and closely monitored for how they're actually operating. But I would say fundamentally, the bottom two buckets are the ones where the leading institutions are really starting to hone in on to actually ensure that they have effective management. So once you've laid all of that out, it's really about your capabilities. And the first three buckets, 11, 12, and 13, are about your people, right? So you can lay out the best policies and frameworks and procedures. You can map all of the things that you do and your potential exposures and what you should be doing to mitigate those. But if you don't have the people, either because they don't have the skills to actually understand or execute on the roles and responsibilities that have been laid out on them, or they don't have the capacity because this is just one more thing that is laid on top of them and there's no clear prioritization on how they should be allocating their time against that. But even if they have the skills and capacity, if there isn't the mindset behind that of would really drive that this is important and that this is something that is critical to the mission, there's oftentimes potential for slippage and drift and correspondingly the behavior shift with that. And then the final two, I think, which are critically important, is this mindset of a process improvement. So there's usually an underlying infrastructure in institutions that lay out what is it that is critical for delivering on the mission. So what are the most important processes? What are the biggest risks that are associated with each one of those processes? And then how do I think about, again, continually building the infrastructure behind that? So as we learn things in different entities or in different functions, we can bring that back, obviously, and cross-pollinate that across all the entities. And there is, of course, ultimately an underlying technology, data, and analytics, I think, which we referenced earlier, which I think the challenge here is oftentimes people lead with the technology, data, and analytics, which leads to, let's create a great big data lake, and then once we have all of the data, we'll be able to create great insights from our analytics. But there isn't the targeted review of what is actually the technology requirements we need, right? Is it more data storage? Is it more system capacity? Or is it simple workflow management tools? Is it, from a data perspective, are there data sets that we already have that we could be using more? And analytics do we really have a clear view of what use cases we want to be developing? So instead of letting the quant jocks run and create really fancy analytics using the most recent techniques in AI and machine learning, what is it that you actually need to know as an executive in order to really identify, measure, and monitor and control your risk better? And really taking a top-down view on that, I think, is important. And then ultimately, you'll read through that some of this is obviously pulled from the private sector as company, but the operational risk outcomes, right? So we call it operational, but it's actually your risk outcomes. And are you able to ultimately mitigate your exposures such that you can do more, either by freeing up from a reputation perspective, the senior executive mindset share to really focus on delivering on the mission versus crisis management, as Jay mentioned earlier, is another big piece of this. And then also are you able to deploy your resources in a more efficient way such that you can do more with what you already have within your mandate? So I've said a lot. I think I may have gone over my time a little bit, but happy to take questions and move on to the next section.
Super. Many thanks, Dan. At this stage, we've got about 13 minutes if we stick to our time limit and respect everyone's commitment to this hour. Happy to take any questions. If you wouldn't mind just identifying yourself and then ideally directing your question to one of the three of us, we'll be happy to respond. And if you don't have a question per se, but have a comment about how you do risk management in your state, that would also be very much appreciated, because I think one of the core goals, as Jamie mentioned at the outset, is to share information across the board, what folks are doing in various different state contexts. Jay,
this is Alan McVeigh. I just needed to make a comment, just continuing your thoughts there. I believe the whole webinar will be posted on the NASCA website, and you will be able to access that. And I would also like to say that after your review of that and after going through our discussion here, if you have any questions, I believe, Jamie, that website also gives them our contact information.
Yes, so thank you so much for giving the plug for the NASCA website. This webinar recording and the slides will be on the website. We have a new part on our website that's called NASCA webinars. So you can go back and watch all of the new e-learning we have. And then you can, in the directory, there's a one that says member profiles. You can hit the directory and you can find your contact information.
Very good.
And then if we would love to hear from those, even if you just identify your name and your state or something interesting you're doing. And if you are on mute, remember to unmute yourself, or you can use the chat box. NASCA is all about convening great thought leaders, and so we love the idea to share and connect with other people. Well, we have a pretty shy group here today, Jay and Dan and Alan. Any kind of big takeaways left, or what else would you like to know about? I know we just briefly went into risk. This is a small part of the survey. Any other big takeaways or aha moments from doing this partnership?
I'll just offer one additional point, and while folks are thinking about questions or comments they may have, or even if any of this resonated with you, after we gave the presentation in Oklahoma City, there were several folks who came up to us, and over the course of the rest of the few days we had together, they made comments along the lines of what you said was basically what I've been thinking, but haven't been able to articulate it myself. And you know, my response to that repeatedly was, we didn't come up with any of this. This was all directly from the states themselves. But it led to a lot of really interesting conversations about various ways in which states not only can improve, but the specific things they're trying to overcome. And for many states, it was funding. How can we get the legislature interested in this? How do we get the resources we need in order to build up some of the skills and capabilities that Dan referenced? How do we get agency leaders across the board to be interested in this? How do we convene at that senior executive level a board that's really going to in turn take some of the findings or some of the conclusions and drive those down into their agencies? So those are some of the major topics we've been discussing with state leaders, not just in Oklahoma City, but since then. And I will say, just based on the survey results and based on those conversations, this seems to be very much an active topic for especially CAOs who have this responsibility. So you're not alone if you're feeling like this is an emerging priority for you.
I'll echo that's definitely a trend that we have heard here at NASCA. We survey our members every year on their top priorities for the year, and risk management hasn't made, of all the priorities, the chief administrator has a very varied profile. Risk management I definitely see as a merging topic, especially with technology and cybersecurity concerns. But I did get 2 questions in the meantime that I'm going to pose to the group that came in the chat box. First, if you have no current risk management program, where do you start?
Dan, would you like to take that?
Yeah, thanks Jay and Jamie, and thank you, Tracy. So, Tracy, I think it's a fantastic question, and it leads also to the point that Jay was making, is that risk management is oftentimes a highly theoretical topic that's hard to find the entry point into actually starting to develop an effective program. And so my short answer would be, not just because of the pages in the presentation, but focus first on creating that taxonomy in common language, because then that allows you to build the stakeholder agreement that this is important, right? As you lay out, here are the different types of risks that we face, and then you can start articulating for each of those risks, where do you see that you have more or less developed risk management programs, and also overlay that with what's the real type of exposure. So if an event were to happen, what would be the corresponding impact to the potential financial losses is one piece, but really the reputation and standing of the governmental entity. And I think starting there and then using that as a way of, okay, creating a coverage map across the different either functions that you're responsible for, or entities at the broader state level, and saying, okay, where do we feel as an executive group that we have, it may not be perfect and it may not be exact, but if there's something there that's effective, where do we focus where we think we have the biggest gaps today? And then I would say, where within the framework, and I would then create a framework similar to the third page that we had, maybe simpler than what we had, could be more complex, but I would try and err on simplicity if you can. What are the pieces that we want to start building so in a way that we could actually, prototype in an entity, codify leading practices, build leading practice, codify it, and then think of it as a multi-year journey as you would then build there and expand into different places, right? And it's some of the piece of setting the language, setting the framework, setting the risk appetite. A lot of those are doing the top-down risk assessment. A lot of it is essentially, what is your risk strategy? And making sure that you have the underpinnings for it, and then it's a build, right? And it's a multi-year effort to build those out. But of course, Alan, you're living it, so we'd love to hear your experiences and thoughts as well.
And I agree with you. There is one question here, and I have to get to a 3 o'clock directors meeting. But Heather actually went into the chat room. She mentioned that she feels here in West Virginia there are risks unique to the public sector. What in particular was I thinking about? Two things come to mind. Number one, I did mention we unfortunately periodically have flooding issues here in our state because we have the mountains, and when it rains, the mountains flow into valleys, and they tend to unfortunately have devastating flooding at times. That can be a real budget buster, so you have to be proactive in trying to prevent those things. The other thing is our economy in and of itself. We are a natural resource state that relies heavily on severance taxes for the energy type sectors that we do provide those natural resources to, coal, timber, natural gas. And those markets tend to fluctuate. Therefore, our revenues coming into state government tend to fluctuate along with those industries. And we have to come up with some way of trying to provide some sort of stable risk mechanism so that we can even operate during those bad budget times. So those are two items that we have to be very proactive about. Also, Michael chimed in and said he liked how we conveyed a proactive approach to risk management as opposed to a reactive stance, which we often see. It's basically you have insurance, and if you have a bad thing happen, then you expect the insurance company to pay the claim. It's much better to be proactive because over a period of time you can reduce your costs greatly by taking that stance. And I think that's what all of us should be looking at and having to do going forward.
Alan, if I could just add on to that, I completely agree with you in terms of reducing costs and being able to flatten out your overall resource allocations over time. But I will say that I've seen several instances where there were entities that did not do this kind of risk management, did not lay out the taxonomy, that did not prioritize around what's probable and what the impact would be, and were essentially caught flat-footed. And not only was there kind of an immediate cost, both financial and reputational, there was sort of a long-term rebuilding process. And when those costs are so high that it creates a crisis, however we define cost, there's sort of an additional very difficult period that the organization has to undergo where it's not only stabilizing itself, but doing all of this work on the back end, which could have been done on the front end. And so what essentially we have seen is that some of the organizations that are most committed to enterprise risk management or risk preparation are those that have actually faced a really serious difficulty, have recognized they weren't adequately prepared and know they don't want to go through that again. And it's been a big takeaway, and they're some of the biggest evangelists for doing this work, that when you have a chance, when you have the money and when you have the time, you should take every measure you can to put yourself in the best possible position for what inevitably could go wrong. So it's a great insight, and one that we hear again and again from folks around the country.
And Jay, I would just say amen to that.
Well, with that, it looks like we ended right on time. I really appreciate everyone that's been able to attend the call. And since we got a nice plug there, I just want to reiterate, you'll be able to find these going forward we will have a webinars landing page here on our website. And you'll see past recordings of videos, as well as the slide deck will be here. And the full report is actually in our research page. So as I mentioned, this was a part of a larger survey that related to 3 reports that NASCA has put out around real estate, digital government, and risk. And this is an effort to really share best practices and come out with white papers that could be an effort to our members. So with that, I really thank everyone. I thank so much the partnership over the last 2 years of doing our annual survey and our annual report, identifying what is critical to chief administrators. And so our goal here at NASCA is to support the state chief administrators and their teams in order to transform government operations. So if there's anything that we can do for you and your state, that is what we are happy to do, to connect you to other state leaders or to provide resources. So with that, thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Ann.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.